Hello, welcome to this lesson where we're going to talk about different backend options for your app. So first of all, what is a backend and why do you need one? You may have noticed that a lot of the beginner tutorials on iOS, you build simple stuff like calculators or maybe news readers or something like that, and it's purely one-sided. The user is only consuming content and not producing content. And the reason why is that as soon as you get into the realm of user accounts, or account management or producing content, that data that the user produces or that account that they created needs to be stored somewhere. Like that information, that data, it needs to exist somewhere. So that's where we get into the back-end territory, where we need some sort of data store or database to hold that data. And furthermore, in the case of the user producing data that needs to be seen by other devices or other users, it's not enough to store the data locally on the device. You actually need to store the data somewhere that all of the different users can access that data. So here are some examples where you would need to consider a backend for your app. So if you have some notion of user accounts, whether that's logging in or creating an account or registering, whether you have leaderboards, if you have users posting or generating content, if you're messaging other users, if you're liking content, you need to store that relationship somewhere. Or even if you want to implement the functionality where you sync data between different devices. So if a user uses two different devices and you want to sync that data between those two devices for the same user, you would still need a backend. So let's take a look at the diagram and see what this sort of setup looks like. I mentioned a little bit about a server and a database, but visually, what does that look like? So in this diagram, we have two people, client A and client B. They're using the same app on their respective devices. And we have a server. So a server is usually a physical piece of hardware. It may be a computer. It may be, well, generally, it is a computer that's specifically built to handle incoming requests from clients and then return the appropriate response. So the server is a physical piece of hardware, and a database is more of like, it's not a physical thing, but it's a way to store data in a organized and relevant format, which makes it easy to query and return data or to populate data. So a database is just a system of data management, but the actual data is stored on hard disks in the server. So for client A, if the user is creating an account or generating some content or liking something, or maybe they got a high score and you're posting it on the leaderboard, client A would send that data to the server as denoted by those arrows, and then the server would store that data. Now client B, another user somewhere else, using the same app, when they send a request to that server to return, let's say, all the high scores or all of the latest messages, or different users that are on their friends list or whatever, the server returns that data to client B, which includes the data that client A just submitted to it. So in this way, you have multiple clients sending data to the server to store on the database, and the server also retrieves and sends information back to the clients to display. Now, this is a simplified example because in reality, you probably have not just a single server, but it'll be distributed between multiple servers. But the idea is there. So if you need to store data or sync data across different devices, you're going to need to implement something like this following diagram. This shows how an iOS app would interact with a traditional MySQL database. And if you're not familiar with MySQL databases, they're most often used with websites and web apps. But whenever I teach iOS to beginners, I get an overwhelming request for showing people how to interact with a MySQL database. So this diagram illustrates how that would work. The iOS app can't connect to the database directly. Instead, you need to build additional server-side architecture, which I have written there as web services, which is essentially just code that sits in between the client and the server. It handles the requests from the client and then interacts with the server or with the database. I guess in this diagram it's not completely clear, but the web services will connect to the database and then either query data for returning to the client, or it will insert data into the database. So the iPhone app can't connect to the database to do that directly. And so you have to learn another programming language and build additional infrastructure just to interact with that MySQL database. However, this isn't the only option for a backend for your app. Recognizing that people just wanted to build apps, not necessarily fumble around with server-side architecture and server-side code, these things called a backend as a service started cropping up. And essentially, what they do for you is remove away all of that complexity and just gives you a set of web services to interact with. So you don't even have to build the web services. You don't have to set up your database. You don't have to worry about that database architecture. All you need to do is send the data from your client to the web service and then query the data back. What happens behind the scenes, you don't have to worry about. And to make it easier still, a lot of these platforms have frameworks or SDKs that you can add into your Xcode project. So you don't even need to create a request and send it to the web services. All you need to do is stay in Xcode and read the platform documentation on how to save data and how to retrieve data. So what are some of the advantages for using these platforms or backends as a service? Well, to me, the biggest advantage is that you can stay focused on building your app and you don't have to worry about setting up all of that server-side architecture. It's also very scalable and secure. A lot of these platforms are built for the purpose of just being the backend for your app. And so if your app takes off and becomes really popular, you don't have to worry about buying more servers and replicating your database across the servers and all of that stuff, because these platforms are built for that and it just kind of happens automatically behind the scenes. It ends up saving you a lot of time because it's not just the setup, right? It's the maintenance as well. So if you have your own databases and your own servers to worry about, you're worrying about your servers and keeping them patched and up to date. If you get attacked by hackers or something like that, then you're worried about getting your servers back up and running. Not to say that these platforms can't be hacked or can't be under attack, but it's just that you won't have to worry about getting them back up and running. And lastly, these platforms make it really easy to use. Like I mentioned, they have frameworks you can just add to your Xcode project and start using. So in the following lessons, we're going to be looking at one of these backends as a service called Parse. And it's got a very generous free plan, so you don't have to worry about paying unless your app becomes really popular. And it's actually my favorite one out of them all. If you're interested in MySQL or using iCloud as a backend, then check out the iOS Toolbox course on my site where I cover those two platforms and many other topics. But in the upcoming lessons, I'll show you guys how to integrate Parse into your project and how to save and retrieve data. All right, bye for now, and I'll see you guys in the next lesson.